Morning in Ravens. Ford began with the wind lashing across wooden awnings and the smell of red dust clinging to the narrow streets. The sun had barely climbed over the eastern hills, spilling gold over faded signboards where tethered horses chewed lazily on dry hay. But today, the usually quiet town was buzzing. Folks were spilling out of the saloon, the blacksmith shop, and the general store, making their way toward the courthouse, a two-story timber building with squeaky shutters and a crooked sign that read Ravens Ford Justice Hall. Everyone knew why. Ethan Cole, the cowboy from the edge of town, was on trial for shooting Leland Cobb's prized bull. And not just any bull. It was a breeding stud worth a small fortune, the pride of Cobb's herd. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with sweat, tobacco, and trail dust. Townsfolk packed the benches, while latecomers leaned against the walls, eager for a show. At the bench sat Judge Merrick, a silver-haired man with eyes sharp as a hawk's. He slammed his gavel twice. "Order," he barked, his gravelly voice cutting through the chatter. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, boots dusty, cotton shirt worn thin. He didn't deny the charge. "I made a mistake," he said evenly, meeting the judge's gaze. "It was dark. I thought it was a wolf after my horses." Leland Cobb shot to his feet, pointing a finger. "Mistake? Do you have any idea what that bull was worth?" Judge Merrick rubbed his chin. "By law, you owe the man full value for the animal." A murmur rippled through the room as Ethan admitted he couldn't pay. Jail for 6 months was the only lawful recourse, and 6 months in a cell meant his horses would starve, his land go to waste, and his life fall apart. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. Then, he looked toward a corner of the room. A gray-haired man stood there, gripping the arm of a young Apache woman. Her eyes were black and steady, her long hair bound roughly with a strip of cloth. Her clothes were torn, her bare feet caked with dust. "Tiana," Merrick called. "You were just bought by Mr. Cobb, weren't you?" Cobb smirked. "Bought her this morning. $5, Your Honor." A gasp swept the room. $5 for a human being less than the cost of a revolver. Merrick's voice came slow and deliberate. "Cole, I'll give you an alternative. You can't pay in dollars, but you can pay another way. Marry her." The room went silent, then burst into laughter and whistles. Ethan frowned, glancing at Tiana. She didn't look frightened. She stood tall, lips pressed tight, her gaze a cold blade against the crowd. "Marriage to pay a debt? You're joking," Ethan said. "No joke," Merrick replied. "You'll take responsibility for her, feed her, protect her. No selling, no abandoning. Refuse, and I sign the order for your arrest right now." Ethan took a long breath. The laughter, the stares, the smell of dust and sweat, all of it pressed in. He knew the choice before him. 6 months in jail and ruin, or a forced marriage to a complete stranger. He looked at Tiana again, still unflinching, still meeting his eyes. "All right," he said at last, voice hard. "I'll marry her." Merrick brought the gavel down. "Then it's settled. The ceremony will be held this afternoon." The courtroom erupted in cheers and jeers, but Ethan only clenched his fists, knowing his life had just taken a turn no man could have predicted. The sun hung high when the church bell tolled. Its rusty clang echoed through Ravens Ford, calling the curious to witness the strangest wedding the town had ever seen. By the time Ethan Cole stepped onto the dusty street, half the town was already lining the boardwalks, whispering and smirking. Tiana stood by the steps of the courthouse, her wrists free now, though the rope burns still showed. She wore the same faded buckskin dress she'd arrived in, cleaned only by a quick splash of water from the pump. Her hair hung loose down her back, black as midnight, a stubborn streak glinting in her eyes. Ethan approached with the same grim expression he'd worn at the trial. His hat shadowed his face, but the set of his jaw made it clear this wasn't a day for romance. He offered no hand, no smile, just a short nod. The preacher, a thin man named Wilkins who smelled faintly of whiskey, cleared his throat. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, opening a worn Bible. The small crowd leaned in, hungry for every awkward moment. Wilkins began the vows, his voice barely carrying over the occasional cough or chuckle from the onlookers. Ethan answered his lines with short, clipped I do's. When it came to Tiana, There was a pause long enough for a few murmurs to rise. She stared straight at Ethan, her gaze defiant, before answering, "I will." It wasn't submission. It was something colder, like she was making a promise to herself. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. There was no kiss, just the scrape of boots on wood, as Ethan stepped back. Cobb, leaning against a post, grinned like a man watching a fine joke play out. Ethan ignored him. "Let's go," Ethan said quietly to Tiana. She followed without a word. They walked the mile out of town in silence. The road was nothing but red dirt and sagebrush, the heat shimmering off the horizon. Ethan led his horse, carrying the few belongings he'd brought to town. Tiana carried nothing at all. His cabin stood on a rise overlooking a narrow creek. It was small, one room, with a stone hearth and a table built from rough pine boards. The barn leaned slightly, but the corral fence was solid. Two horses lifted their heads at the newcomers. Ethan opened the door and stepped inside, letting the cool shade swallow him. Tiana lingered on the threshold, her eyes scanning every corner as if memorizing escape routes. "You can have the bed," Ethan said, setting his hat on a peg. "I'll take the floor for now." "I don't need your bed," she replied, her voice low but edged. "Sout yourself." He fetched water from the creek while she moved quietly inside, examining the shelves, the single window, the narrow cot. She didn't touch anything, but her gaze lingered on a tin cup, a folded blanket, a small stack of books by the hearth, signs of a man who lived alone and expected to keep it that way. That evening, they ate in silence. Bread, beans, and coffee. She sat across from him, shoulders straight, eyes steady. Every now and then, he caught her watching him, as if weighing something in her mind. When the meal was done, Ethan spoke. "I didn't ask for this any more than you did. But I'm not sending you back to Cobb. You can work here, earn your keep, and when you've had enough, you can leave." She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I don't take orders. Not from you. Not from anyone." Ethan gave a short nod. "We'll see how long that lasts." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the barn. Somewhere in the dark hills, a coyote called. Inside the small cabin, two strangers sat on opposite sides of the fire, each certain of one thing: they would not be the first to bend. The first week passed in silence thick enough to choke on. Ethan rose before dawn, tending the horses in the dim gray light. Tiana stayed inside, stoking the fire, cooking just enough food for the both of them. They rarely spoke, only when necessary, and then in the fewest words possible. When he rode out to check the far pasture, she'd wander the creek bank, barefoot, collecting smooth stones or trailing her hands through the cold water. Sometimes, when he returned, he'd see her standing on the ridge above the cabin, looking west toward the mountains. Always west. One afternoon, Ethan came back from the pasture to find a line of fish drying on a rope strung between two posts. "You catch these?" he asked. She didn't look up from the knife she was cleaning. "I'm not going to starve waiting for you." He grunted and carried the fish inside without another word. At night, he rolled out his blanket on the floor by the hearth, while she took the cot against the wall. The firelight painted shadows across her face as she lay still, eyes open. Ethan wasn't sure if she slept at all. The townsfolk didn't help. When Ethan rode in for supplies, he caught their sly glances and half smiles. Cobb made a show of tipping his hat. "How's married life, Cole? She got you dancing to her tune yet?" Ethan ignored him, though his knuckles tightened on the reins. On the fourth day, Ethan found the corral gate unlatched. His best roan mare stood outside, tail swishing. He herded her back in, then turned to find Tiana leaning against the fence. "You forget to latch it?" he asked. She shrugged. Maybe she wanted to run. He stepped closer. "That mare's worth more than this cabin. You let her go. You're putting us both in trouble." She met his gaze without flinching. "Your trouble, not mine." Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing down the anger rising in his chest. "You're under this roof now. That makes it yours too." Her lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "I don't want your roof." The days kept stacking up like dry firewood, quiet, brittle, waiting for a spark. That spark came one evening when Ethan returned to find the barn door swinging open. Inside, Tiana was perched on a hay bale, cradling his rifle. She was turning it in her hands, testing the weight. "That's not a toy," Ethan said, stepping forward. "I know," she replied. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes, memory, maybe, or warning. "Where I come from, you don't last long if you don't know how to use one." He hesitated. "You ever fired one of these?" She nodded once. "At men who thought they owned me." The words hung in the dusty air. For the first time, Ethan saw something past her defiance, something sharp and dangerous, forged long before she set foot in his cabin. He took the rifle from her hands, slow and steady. "If you're going to handle this, you do it right. I'll teach you." Her brow lifted. "Why?" "Because out here," he said, "the world won't give you a choice." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a single, reluctant nod. It wasn't peace, not by a long shot, but it was the first crack in the wall between them. And in the West, even the smallest crack could change the course of everything. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, though the sky hadn't broken yet. By mid-morning, Ethan was repairing a section of fence along the east pasture when he heard hoofbeats fast, urgent. He stood, wiping sweat from his brow, and saw dust rising on the road. A lone rider came into view. Jeremiah Pike, a ranch hand from the neighboring spread. He pulled up hard, chest heaving, eyes wide. "Bandits," Pike said without preamble. "3 of them hit the Kettle Farm an hour ago. Took 2 horses, maybe headed this way." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You sure?" Pike nodded. "They were riding light, but they had rifles. Figured you'd want to know." Without another word, Ethan mounted his roan and galloped for the cabin. Tiana was outside, splitting kindling. She looked up as he rode in. "Get inside," he said. Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Trouble's coming." He swung down from the saddle and grabbed his rifle from the rack by the door. "Bandits. 3 men. If they want horses, we've got 2 worth stealing." Instead of moving inside, she set the axe down and reached for the spare rifle leaning near the porch. Ethan's eyes flicked to her hand, steady, practiced. "You know how to use that?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "You said you'd teach me," she replied. "No time like now." "Ho." He considered arguing, but there was no time. "Stay behind cover. Don't fire unless I say." They moved fast. Ethan unhitched the horses, driving them into the barn and bolting the door. Tiana took position behind the corral fence, eyes fixed on the road. The silence between them was sharp as a drawn blade. It didn't last long. The first rider appeared over the ridge, then 2 more, all of them lean, hard-faced men in dust-stained coats. They slowed when they saw the cabin, circling wide, eyes scanning for easy pickings. One of them called out, voice carrying across the open ground. "Afternoon. We're looking for water and a place to rest our stock." Ethan stepped forward just enough to be seen. "Keep riding." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Not very neighborly. The second man shifted in his saddle, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "We'll just help ourselves then." That was all the warning they gave. The first shot cracked through the air, splintering the porch rail beside Ethan. He ducked, returning fire with a clean, sharp report from his rifle. One of the bandits' horses screamed and bolted. The fight was quick and vicious. The bandits circled, firing from the saddle, while Ethan and Tiana used the fence and the barn for cover. Twice he caught glimpses of her, steadying her aim, waiting for the right moment before firing. Each shot she took forced a rider to pull back, buying them precious seconds. Then the third man broke from the group, spurring his horse straight for the barn. Ethan swore under his breath. "He's after the stock." He sprinted toward the barn, but the rider was faster until Tiana stepped out from behind the fence. She raised the rifle, braced it against her shoulder, and fired. The shot hit the dirt just ahead of the horse, sending it skidding sideways in panic. The rider cursed, wheeled away, and galloped off toward the ridge. The remaining 2 followed, disappearing over the rise as quickly as they'd come. Only the echo of hoofbeats remained. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan lowered his rifle and walked toward her. "Good shooting." She didn't smile, didn't preen, just checked the rifle and set it back against the fence. You said the world wouldn't give me a choice, she said. Looks like you were right. And they worked in silence to reset the horses in the corral and check for damage. A few fence posts were splintered, but nothing they couldn't fix. When the last tool was put away, Ethan glanced at her across the yard. I've worked with men who couldn't hold their nerve like you just did. She met his gaze, unreadable. I've seen worse than 3 men on horses. He didn't press, but as he turned back toward the cabin, a thought settled in his mind. She wasn't just surviving here. She was proving herself, one fight at a time. That night, over a simple supper of beans and bread, there was less distance between them. Not warmth, not yet, but something had shifted. Out in the West, trust was hard to win. And once won, it was harder still to break. 3 days after the bandit trouble, Ethan hitched the wagon to make a supply run into Raven's Ford. He didn't invite Tiana, but she climbed onto the seat beside him without asking. The road was quiet, except for the creak of the wagon wheels. A thin breeze stirred the dust, carrying with it the faint scent of rain still trapped in the clouds. Ethan kept his eyes on the trail. Tiana kept hers on the horizon. When they rolled into town, heads turned. The general store's porch filled with idle men, their talk slowing as they watched the wagon pull up. Ethan could feel the eyes on them, the kind of stares that measured, judged, and decided. Inside the store, Mrs. Miller greeted Ethan with a polite nod, her eyes flicking to Tiana and then quickly away. Mr. Cole, flowers in the back. Got that coffee you like? 2. Ethan nodded. 2 sacks of flour, 1 coffee, salt, and the door swung open with a bang. Cobb Bruin walked in, his boots loud against the floorboards. He spotted them instantly, his grin spreading like oil on water. Well, if it ain't Mr. and Mrs. Cole, Cobb drawled, dragging out each word. Didn't think you'd last the week. Ethan ignored him, moving toward the shelves. Cobb followed, stepping deliberately into his path. Tell me, Cole, she call you husband yet? Or you just keep her in the barn? A couple of the men by the stove chuckled. Ethan kept his hands busy stacking tins of beans in his basket. You're in my way, Broen. Cobb's grin widened. Just asking. See, some of us figure you've got yourself a wild one there. Maybe too wild for a man like you. He turned his eyes to Tiana, his voice dropping into something uglier. Course, maybe that's what you like. Something you gotta break in. The laughter grew. Tiana stood still as stone, her dark eyes fixed on Cobb. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. You'd be the one to break, not me. The room went still. Cobb's face flushed, and the smirk twisted into something harder. Careful, girl. Folks round here don't take kindly to your kind mouthing off. Ethan set the basket down on the counter. That's enough. Or what? Cobb stepped closer, his breath sour with tobacco. You gonna fight me in front of half the town? Ethan didn't raise his voice. If that's what it takes to shut you up. The tension in the room snapped like a pulled wire. Cobb's hand hovered near his belt, but he didn't draw. He glanced around, saw the eyes watching, and let out a low laugh. You got some fire in you, Cole. Guess we'll see how long it burns. N. He shoved past, shouldering Ethan hard, before leaving the store. Mrs. Miller let out the breath she'd been holding. You two better take your things and go before there's more trouble. Ethan paid, loaded the supplies into the wagon, and they left town without another word. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Tiana spoke. You didn't have to do that. Do what? Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Stand up for me in there. He shrugged. Yeah, I did. Cobb's been trouble since before you came along. You just gave him another excuse. She was silent for a moment. Where I come from, a man lets someone insult him. It means he's weak. Ethan's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. Guess it's the same out here. The rest of the ride passed in silence. But it wasn't the same kind of silence they'd shared before. It was heavier, like both of them were turning something over in their minds. That night, after the horses were stabled and the supplies stored, Ethan stepped onto the porch. The sky above was black velvet pricked with stars. Tiana was already there, sitting on the top step. You know Cobb's not going to leave it alone, he said. She didn't look at him. I've had worse than him come after me. Maybe. But worse doesn't make him harmless. She finally turned her head. You're not afraid of him. No, Ethan said. But I'm not fool enough to think one man can't cause a heap of trouble if he's determined. For a long time, they sat without speaking, the night sounds filling the space between them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped. Ethan thought about the look in Cobb's eyes when he'd walked out of the store. That wasn't the look of a man who'd been shamed into silence. It was the look of a man waiting for the right time to strike. And in the West, sooner or later, that time always came. Winter came early to the valley that year. One morning, Ethan woke to find the world outside wrapped in white, the snow lying deep against the barn doors. The fire in the hearth had burned low. He pushed himself up from his blanket on the floor and felt the chill creep into his bones. Tiana was already awake, crouched by the fireplace, coaxing the embers back to life. The light from the flames caught the loose strands of her hair. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Coffee's on. They fell into the kind of routine that winter forces on people. Ethan hauled water from the creek when it wasn't frozen solid. Tiana mended clothes, cooked what little fresh food they had left, and kept the fire going. They spoke more than they used to, though still in short, practical exchanges. It was during one of those days that trouble found them in a quieter form. Ethan came in from splitting wood, stamping snow from his boots, and saw her leaning against the table, pale, one hand braced on its edge. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." She tried to straighten, but the motion sent her swaying. He crossed the room in 2 steps, catching her before she could fall. Her skin was hot, fever burning under the surface. "You're not fine," he said. She tried to pull away. "I don't need. You need to sit." He cut in, guiding her toward the cot. "And you're going to stay there until this breaks." She scowled, but didn't fight him this time. Ethan fetched a basin of water, soaking a cloth and laying it across her forehead. "You'll drink as much as I put in front of you," he said. For the next 2 days, the snow kept falling and so did her fever. Ethan stayed close, feeding the fire, making broth, forcing her to sip when she didn't want to. He barely slept, listening for every shift of her breathing. On the 3rd night, she stirred and opened her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice rough. He frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "I mean, you didn't choose me." "Not really." Ethan sat back on his heels. "Doesn't matter. You're here. That's enough." Something in her expression softened. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't look away either. By the 4th day, her fever broke. She was still weak, but her eyes had some of their old sharpness back. When she sat up and swung her legs over the side of the cot, Ethan was there with a steadying hand. "You don't have to," she began. "Yeah, I do," he said, not letting go until she was steady on her feet. That evening, they shared the first real meal together in weeks, rabbit stew and bread warmed by the fire. It wasn't much, but it felt different, easier. Afterward, Ethan stepped outside to check the sky. The snow had stopped, and the moonlight turned the valley silver. When he came back in, Tiana was sitting in his chair by the fire, wrapped in his old wool coat. He didn't say anything, just crossed the room and set another log on the flames. She glanced at him, then back to the fire. "You take care of people, don't you?" she said. He shrugged. "Somebody has to." "Where I came from," she murmured. "Nobody did. Not unless they wanted something in return." Ethan didn't answer right away. "Maybe that's why you ended up here. Out here, folks either look out for each other or they don't last." She gave a small, tired smile, the first he'd seen from her that wasn't laced with defiance. They didn't speak again for the rest of the night, but the air between them had shifted. Not warm, not yet, but no longer frozen. And in a winter like this, even that small thaw could mean survival. The thaw came late. By the time the snow receded from the hills, the earth beneath was soft and treacherous. Ethan was mending a harness strap in the barn when the first sign of trouble arrived. Not in the form of gunfire or shouting, but a single set of hoofprints in the fresh mud outside the gate. He crouched to study them. The pattern was too crisp, too deliberate. Someone had ridden up to the edge of the property and stopped. That evening, he told Tiana over supper. She didn't look surprised. "You think it's him?" I know it's him. Ethan's voice was quiet, certain. Then why wait? Because Cobb ruins the kind who likes to rattle the fence before he comes through it. Lets you stew in the knowing. For the next week, life went on with a taut edge. Ethan worked the land, repaired fence lines, checked the stock. Tiana kept the house, but he noticed her spending more time near the rifle. She didn't ask for lessons now. She practiced on her own, steady and methodical. The trouble broke on a Friday. They had taken the wagon into town for supplies, the sky a flat gray that threatened rain. The streets were muddy, the storefronts slick from the last shower. Ethan kept his hat low, steering the wagon toward Miller's store. Cobb was waiting on the boardwalk. He leaned against a post, arms folded, eyes locked on them as they drew closer. Two of his men flanked him, neither smiling. Well, Cobb said, stepping forward. Cole, and the lady, heard you had a cozy winter. End of fort. Ethan didn't slow. Move. Cobb grinned, but his eyes stayed cold. You know, I had business out near your place last week. Couldn't help noticing you've still got those fine horses. Shame if something were to happen to them. Ethan stopped the wagon. You come near my land again. What? Cobb cut in, taking a slow step forward. You'll shoot me in the middle of town? Folks might see that as murder. One of the men chuckled. Or maybe they just thank him for saving you the trouble. Tayana's gaze never left Cobb's face. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. You've been sniffing around like a coyote too long, Brone. Sooner or later, you're going to get caught in a trap. The grin faltered. Cobb took one more step forward, so close Ethan could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. Careful, girl. You're a long way from anywhere that matters. Out here, no one's coming if you scream. Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle resting across his lap. Get out of the way, Broen. For a moment, Cobb just stared at him. Then he stepped aside, slowly, like he was letting them pass out of choice, not because he'd been forced. As they rolled past, Ethan didn't look back, but he felt the weight of Cobb's eyes burning into them, the promise in that look as clear as a spoken threat. They made it home without incident, but Ethan knew better than to think it was over. That night, he took the lantern and walked the property line twice. No fresh tracks, no sign of disturbance. Still, he slept light, rifle within reach. 2 days later, just before dawn, the dog started barking. Ethan was on his feet instantly, boots pulling on over bare feet. He was halfway to the door when a gunshot cracked across the yard. Tiana was right behind him, rifle in hand. They stepped out into the cold morning air. Across the pasture, two riders were disappearing into the fog, the echo of hoofbeats fading. One of the corral gates swung open. The latch splintered. Inside, the horses were restless but unharmed. Ethan swore under his breath. That was a warning. Tiana's eyes were hard. Then we warned them back. For a moment, he just looked at her. In the dim light, she looked like she belonged here, boots in the mud, hair loose in the wind, rifle cradled like it was an extension of her hands. We will, he said finally. But not tonight. Cobb wants me rattled. I'm not giving him that. Still, as he closed the gate and checked the latch, Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the line between warnings and bullets disappeared entirely. And when it did, one of them wasn't going to walk away. The morning it happened, the sky was the color of old tin. Low clouds pressed down on the valley, and the air carried that brittle stillness that comes before a storm, whether weather or blood. Ethan saddled his gelding before dawn, checking and rechecking the rifle slung in its scabbard. Tiana came out of the house without a word, a bandolier over her shoulder and the other rifle in her hands. You don't have to come, Ethan said. She gave him a flat look. You said yourself out here, folks look out for each other, or they don't last. He didn't argue. They rode into town slow, not because they were uncertain, but because both knew there'd be no turning back once they crossed that line. The main street was quiet, shutters drawn against the cold wind. Cobb Broen was on the porch of the saloon, leaning back in a chair, his boots propped on the railing like he'd been expecting them. Two of his men lounged nearby, but their hands were never far from their pistols. Well, if it ain't Cole and his wild bride, Cobb called, voice dripping mockery. Come to buy me a drink? Ethan dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. "I'm here to tell you this ends today." Cobb laughed, standing slowly. "Ends? You think you get to decide when I'm done?" He stepped down into the street, hand hovering near his gun. "You've been making me look small, Cole. That's a mistake a man like me can't afford to let slide." Tayana swung down from her horse, eyes locked on Cobb. "You've been sniffing around long enough. Time you found another trail." The men on the porch shifted, tension rippling through the air. Someone inside the saloon pulled back a curtain, peering out. The whole town could feel the moment tightening. Ethan's voice was calm, but his stance was coiled steel. "Walk away, Browen." Cobb sneered. "Or what? Or I put you in the ground." Ulfer. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Cobb's hand twitched toward his holster. Ethan was faster. The crack of his rifle split the air, and Cobb staggered back, clutching his shoulder. One of his men drew Tayana's shot, dropped him before he cleared leather. The other hesitated, then bolted for the alley. Cobb hit the dirt, cursing, his face pale. Ethan stood over him, rifle leveled. "This is me letting you live. You come near my land again, I won't make the same choice." And Cobb's jaw worked, but no words came. Blood soaked his sleeve, and his eyes burned with something between rage and humiliation. Ethan stepped back, lowering the rifle. "Get out of Ravensford." With the help of the man who'd fled, Cobb managed to haul himself to his feet. They staggered away, leaving a trail of red in the dust. By afternoon, word had spread from one end of the valley to the other. Some folks nodded at Ethan when they saw him. Others avoided his eyes. But no one questioned that Cobb Browen's hold on the town was broken. Back at the ranch, Tayana helped unsaddle the horses. "You didn't kill him," she said. "No," Ethan replied. "Sometimes letting a man live with his defeat is worse." She studied him for a moment. "You really believe that?" Ethan looked at her then, and for the first time in months, his gaze held something lighter than caution. "Ask me again if he comes back." The evening settled around them, the wind carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth. The valley was quiet in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Inside, Tayana set the coffee pot on the stove. "So, what happens now?" Ethan shrugged. "We fix the fence. Get the horses back in the south pasture. Make sure there's enough hay to last until spring." She smiled faintly. "That's not what I meant." Ethan poured 2 mugs of coffee, handing her one. "I know." He took a sip, letting the silence stretch. "What happens now is, we see if this thing works. You and me. Not because we were told to, but because maybe it's worth trying." For a long moment, she just watched him. Then she raised her mug in a small salute. "Maybe it is." The fire crackled, the coffee steamed, and outside, the night pressed close around the little house. Whatever came next, they'd face it the way they'd faced everything else, side by side, under the same roof, on the same patch of stubborn land. And in the West, that was as close to a promise as you could get. It's a quiet thing, really, the way peace settles over a place once the storms have passed. Out there in the valley, the air feels different now, lighter, somehow like the land itself has taken a deep breath. And if you stand on that porch as the evening drapes itself across the hills, you might just catch the low murmur of 2 voices inside, the clink of cups, and the steady crackle of a fire that's been tended with care. What Ethan and Tayana built wasn't born out of luck, nor was it handed down like some easy inheritance. It grew from the hard soil of mistakes faced head-on, from the stubborn labor of making amends, and from the choice made more than once to stay and keep building. In the wide sweep of this country's history, it's a small story, maybe, but those are the ones that shape the ground beneath our feet. Like a weathered fence mended plank by plank, love and redemption are rarely sudden, they're earned in the steady, unglamorous work of showing up for each other. And maybe that's the quiet truth we can carry with us. That no matter the years we've already spent, there's still room to lay down new boards over the broken spots in our past. Sometimes the family we end up with isn't the one we started with, it's the one we chose, and who chose us back. Like a lantern burning low in a kitchen window, the simplest act of care can light the way home, even on the darkest stretch of road. So tonight, wherever you are, take a moment to notice the small, steadfast lights around you. Hold on to them, tend them if you can. And if this story has warmed some corner of your heart, Maybe let that warmth spill quietly towards someone else who needs it. Out here or anywhere. Really, that's how we keep the cold at bay.